Knight and Changeling, Chapter 25, Accursed. Jen frowned at the doors to anywhere, repeating the word Charmcaster had given her to access Legerdemain. Still, nothing. Gwen nodded. I was afraid of that. The name's changing. She held out a book that Jen didn't recognize. I may be able to figure it out, though. Kevin frowned. She changed the keys. Jen kicked him in the shin, holding back from using Humungosaur's power to do it, but only just. He howled in pain and hopped around as Jen turned to Gwen. How are you going to figure it out? I wrote a spell that works with a computer algorithm to work out the name before it even changes. Jen nodded, grinning. My super genius magical cousin. Jen leaned on the edge of the doors as Gwen worked. It didn't take her too long to work out the new name and reopen the doors. But both girls could sense that something was wrong when they stepped into the domain of magic. It took Jen a minute to adjust. She hadn't had master control last time she was here, and it really did make all the difference being able to call on Stardust's power in an instant without using the watch. Here, it made her feel like how she used to feel when she still had all her transformations. She shook her head. The last thing she needed to do right now was reminisce about feedback. They had work to do. But it seemed they had arrived in Legerdemain at a touchy time. From what they learned from the rock golem Ignatius, Legerdemain was in the middle of a vicious civil war. Adwaita, though much less powerful, had resurfaced and had re-enslaved a number of beings. He was attempting to gather enough power to face Charmcaster directly, who was leading the fight against him. He was building a device not too far from where the doors had deposited them and guarded it against Charmcaster and her forces. But he won't be expecting us. We could take out the machine, weaken Adwaita even more, then meet up with Charmcaster. Jen stated, nodding as though that was that. Kevin nodded too. She has a point. Help end the Civil War and your ex might be more inclined to talk to you. Jen kicked him again. Drop it. He laughed, rubbing his bruised shin. Adwaita wouldn't be expecting us. Gwen hesitated. She turned to Ignatius. Can you lead us there? Just close enough to see it. He nodded. You must be cautious. Adwaita is mighty even without the Alpha Rune. They nodded, and the rock golem led them off. Charmcaster fiddled with the mirror in her pocket. It had been lighting up steadily over the past few days, but she couldn't help Jen now and didn't want to drag her into the madness Adwaita was causing. Tiber nodded to her. We are ready, Your Highness. Charmcaster nodded. Then let us attack and put an end to Adwaita once and for all. The silver-haired enchantress had been expecting resistance, fighting those under Adwaita's control, but she hadn't expected someone to already be there fighting Adwaita himself. Several someones, actually. Though Gwen stood alone against the turtle creature, Kevin was fighting his underlings, and Jen... Charmcaster scanned the battlefield. She had to be here. If Gwen was here, so was Jen. There! She spotted her in one of her alien forms stepping into the beam of light the machine was generating. No! But it was too late. The beam chipped away at the pink and black crystal that made up this form, and a blood-curdling scream echoed through the air as Jen tilted forward, a green ball of mana joining the other stolen mana in the machine, as her now empty body free-fell. Charmcaster shouted a spell, and a large pink flower bloomed from the stone, catching the limp brunette as Kevin shoved Gwen out of the way of a spell hurled at her by Adwaita. Charmcaster couldn't bring herself to care as she teleported to the flower she'd conjured, even as Kevin's mana joined the other stolen life forces. The flower opened, and Charmcaster flipped Jen over, hoping against hope that it had just been the one alien form that had been taken, that she would sit up and say something witty, but no, her normally shining green eyes were dull and lifeless. Adwaita laughed as Gwen snarled, her skin darkening to purple, her hair and eyes glowing brightly. Charmcaster looked up just in time to see Gwen fall to Adwaita as well. She gripped the Alpha Rune in her hand and chanted, pointing her free hand at the turtle, who began to scream as his skin turned to stone, flaking, and a small totem fell to the stones of Legerdemain. But the spell had already been cast. A great seam opened in the pink sky, white light shining down on her. A deep voice rumbled through her mind. We see your most desperate desire and take the offered payment. Charmcaster shook her head as the lights from the machine flew up into the crack, She easily spotted the one green streak amid pink and felt a sob building. A single orb of mana flew from the crack and resolved into a man she hadn't seen in so long. Tears spilled down her face. Dad? He turned and opened his arms. She ran into them, leaving the limp form of her friend and former lover. Hope, you've grown, but how did this happen? She shook her head. Adwecha, she hiccuped. He was using the life force of the people of Legerdemain. I don't know what he wanted, but he opened the portal to the old ones, and they brought you back. She paused, turning to the bodies strewn over the battlefield. But it shouldn't be like this. Her father nodded, placing his hand on her shoulder. You've grown into a beautiful young woman. And you are right. It shouldn't be like this. I love you, Hope. She turned, and he kissed her on her forehead. Then he took flight, morphing back into an orb of pure mana. The voices rumbled in her mind again. The bargain is rejected. The payment must be returned. The lights flooded back out of the crack. All around the battlefield, people and the magical creatures of Legerdemain were sitting up. A green light flittered past Charmcaster and sunk back into Jen, who gasped in a deep breath as Kevin pulled himself to his feet, rushing to Gwen as the bright light sunk through her skin, too. He blinked as she sat up. Did we just die? His question was quiet. No one answered it either as Charmcaster pulled Jen to her feet. You weren't supposed to be here. I didn't want you to get mixed up in this. That's why I didn't answer your calls. Jen grinned slightly as Charmcaster released her and stooped to pick up a small turtle statue. She slipped it into her bag without looking at it and turned back to Jen. We need your help. Well, you might be able to help us anyway, I don't know. Charmcaster nodded, glad that the green eyes were looking up at her were no longer glassy and empty. I'll see what I can do. Chapter 26, Siren's Song. Charmcaster sent them home so she could deal with the aftermath of the battle. The only advice she could give them as to Gwen's predicament was that, since the connection wasn't direct through skin contact, a metal helmet would likely keep the power from reaching her mind. They had laughed, but she'd been serious. She grinned as she bid them farewell at the door. Maybe you should wear one too, Jen. Wouldn't want anything getting into that pretty little head of yours. The silver-haired enchantress winked at Jen, who grinned. You know, you can call any time. Oh, I will. They grinned at each other as Jen stepped over the threshold of Legerdemain back to Earth. Kevin smirked as the doors closed. She's so not over you, he stated as they blinked around them. They weren't on the shores of the spit of land just off the coast of Indonesia. Instead, they were in the park in the middle of Bellwood. Did we know the doors moved? Jen asked. Kevin called his car. Gwen shook her head. No? I mean, it sort of makes sense. Any magical portal can be summoned, in theory. Jen's phone started to buzz and she pulled it out, frowning at the caller ID. Ken? She answered the call. Gwen looked pretty confused as to why her brother was calling Jen. They weren't nearly as close as she and Jen were. Hey, Ken, what's up? No way! Hell yeah! Actually, do you think you could swing 4? There's a friend who desperately needs to get out of medical for a few hours. You're the best, Ken. Yeah, we'll see you then. Jen hung up the phone. Why didn't you tell me Ken quit school and is running around New York with his band? Gwen let out a laugh. With everything that's been happening, I honestly just forgot. Jen laughed. Kevin stared between the two of them. Wait, Mr. Awesome Mobile is in an actual band? I sort of thought that was a joke. Gwen smacked him in the shoulder. Hey, Volume 10 is a great band. Kevin laughed loudly. I'm sorry, Volume 10? That's the band's name. Both girls looked at each other and laughed again. No joke, that's the band name. They're booked for some end of the summer thing here in Bellwood in like a month. He's getting us 4 backstage passes. Gwen frowned. 4? Jen shrugged. Pierce should be out of medical by then. I want him to have some fun because he's going to be stuck behind a desk for a while. Kevin nodded.
That's nice of you. So, what kind of music are we talking?
Pop rock. Kevin rolled his eyes a little. Jen snorted. Oh, please, Mr. K-pop. They laughed as they headed away from the doors, which vanished behind them. They knew it would take at least a few days for Charmcaster to work out everything from the fight, and they weren't exactly eager to go back to Ledger Domain, having died there so recently. Gwen poured herself back into her studies while Jen and Kevin kept an eye on things. It was only when, a few days later, after their trip to Ledger Domain, Kevin's warehouse was broken into, that they got any kind of action. Jen was thrown into the lake of the small park as the explosion sent Accelerate stumbling through the air. She reached for Ripjaw's power and breathed easier as blue fire swirled over the lake. That couldn't be good, but if she left the lake, she'd be fried. By the time it died down and she resurfaced, Darkstar was gone, but the doors to Anywhere sat at the epicenter of where the explosion had been. She shook herself. Ripjaws faded back to her human form as she swam to the shore. Michael couldn't be happier. He'd found his way to a domain made of magic, and it was ruled over by a beautiful woman, just his age, who was easily susceptible to his powers. He had her wound around his finger easily, just like he'd wound Gwen when they'd first met. He was in the courtyard of her palace, fighting Jen and Kevin while the sorceress fought Gwen. He glanced back, laughing as Gwen came tumbling out of the palace. Jen leapt forward, catching her cousin, careful with her, since the brunette was currently in her ultimate humongosaur form. The sorceress floated down. He smiled at her.
This power is so wonderful. Come on, beautiful, we can crush them all.
She stopped short of taking his hand. You never call me by my name. Michael blinked at her. Sure I do. Her pink eyes narrowed at him. Then what is my name, Michael? Heather. She shrieked. Jen blinked as pink lights flashed around them. They were back in the power plant. The doors were in front of them, too, and Charmcaster tossed Michael out of the doors as he begged for forgiveness, and the power drained out of him. Jen set Gwen back on her feet. Please, I need you. Charmcaster shook her head, shooting an apologetic look at Jen as the doors closed behind her. Michael was still screaming out female names that began with the letter H. Jen shook her head. Shot yourself in the foot there, Michael. The doors vanished, and Michael turned towards them. They ended up finally arresting him and sending him off to Incarsicon. Kevin shook his head.
Not the best of rebounds,
he stated, and Gwen shook her head at him. Not really, Jen said and took off for home. Gwen pecked Kevin on the cheek. Kevin, I love you, but you need to learn some tact. He frowned as she pulled him along to a small coffee shop they sometimes went to when Jen wasn't with them. They ordered and waited. So, I wanted to talk to you. I got accepted into Friedkin University. It's got the program I want, it's Ivy League, and it's on the other coast. I start in August. Kevin grinned.
When are we leaving?
Gwen grinned and pulled Kevin into a kiss. You are the literal best. Thank you for coming with me. He smiled.
Of course I'm coming with you. I love you. Besides, I could use a break from all this madness. No offense to Jen, she's a great friend, but I need a break from her lifestyle.
Gwen nodded. Grandpa Max has a few files for us to look over for her new partner. Kevin sipped his coffee.
She's not gonna like that.
Gwen shrugged. She really doesn't have a choice. According to Grandpa Max, the higher-ups want someone to keep an eye on her. A plumber officer, if not a magister. Kevin nodded.
Makes sense, and it'll give me time to finish up my GED.
He smiled at her as she took his hand. I love you, Kevin.
I love you too, Gwen.